Hi everyone. According to one theory, the legendary Merlin from the tales of King Arthur can be identified with a historical figure from 5th and 6th century Britain. So this theory, which was created and developed by Norma Goodrich, is that Merlin can be identified specifically with a figure called Dubricius. Now Dubricius is a fairly famous bishop from the late 5th to early 6th centuries. Now he was active in southeast Wales. According to tradition, he was the Bishop of Llandaff. Now that specifically is generally not accepted today. It's generally felt that there was no See of Llandaff in that era, but nevertheless he was clearly a very prominent bishop, the most prominent bishop in that area, the area of Llandaff and all of southeast Wales probably, in the time in which he lived, which was the first half of the 6th century. So according to this theory by Norma Goodrich, Merlin can be identified as Dubricius. They were the same person. What's the evidence for this, and does it really stand up to scrutiny? Well, let's take a look. So Norma Goodrich uses 4 main pieces of evidence to support this theory. The first is that, according to legend, Merlin had a miraculous birth. The earliest account which tells the story of the life of Merlin in the 5th century is Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae. So according to that record, Merlin was considered to be a so-called fatherless boy. When Vortigern is trying to build a tower and it keeps on collapsing, his wise men tell him that they need to sacrifice a fatherless boy for the tower to be able to be completed. So his men go and search the kingdom and they bring back Merlin. Merlin Ambrosius is his name. According to some legends, it was specifically an incubus, a type of spirit which fathered Merlin, and so it was kind of like a virgin birth, but in a very unholy way. So he was kind of born from a demon, as it were. That's the idea. And then he was baptized, and that's why he wasn't actually a wicked being. He actually was a force for good, because his baptism at birth drove out the evilness from him. That's the story. But the point is, he had a miraculous birth, and that matches what happened with Dubricius. So in the story of Dubricius, which is the life of Saint Dubricius, which comes from about the 12th century, we find an account of how his mother was pregnant and yet she wasn't married. The account doesn't actually specifically say that it was a miraculous birth. He could just have been illegitimate. The account doesn't explain how she got pregnant. So this isn't a definite match, but it could be. In any case, they were both without a recognized human father, both Dubricius and Merlin. So in that sense, it matches. Also, there's the key issue of the chronology. So Norma Goodrich uses the traditional, let's say, the traditional interpretation that the reign of Vortigern started in the 440s. So that means that some way into his reign, after the Anglo-Saxons have already started invading and everything, that's when Merlin appears. And so Merlin logically should have been born around about the middle of the 5th century. That ties in well with the commonly given dates for Dubricius. His birth is commonly placed in about 465. So that matches, being around about the middle of the 5th century. That would be a good match for the dates of Merlin in Geoffrey of Monmouth's account, where he appears as a boy in the time of Vortigern. So those are 2 of the 3 pieces of evidence that I mentioned earlier. 1, the fact that they were both fatherless in a sense, and 2, the fact that they both lived at about the same time. Also, the 3rd piece of evidence is that in Geoffrey of Monmouth's account, Merlin features prominently throughout much of the 5th century, the reigns of Vortigern and Ambrosius and Uther. But then, when we get to King Arthur's reign, suddenly he disappears, and Dubricius takes the limelight. Dubricius is the one who crowns Arthur as a teenager, and then he appears throughout Arthur's career as an advisor and a spiritual head. So that suggests to Norma Goodrich that Merlin and Dubricius were the same person, and that Geoffrey just switched the names that he used for them. Because otherwise we would expect to see both of them, and yet there's no account in which they both appear as clearly separate people. It's as if it's the same person whose name just changes halfway through. The 4th piece of evidence to support this theory is the fact that both Merlin and Dubricius were strongly associated with miracles. Dubricius, right from his birth, is described as performing miracles, and Merlin also, obviously, is strongly associated with miracles. And there's also the fact, it's not one of the 3 points I was referring to, but there's also just the simple fact that they were both very prominent spiritual people in the kingdom of Arthur's family. Merlin obviously was very prominent, being the advisor to the kings, and Dubricius, likewise, was also the most prominent religious figure in that area at that time. So we can see the appeal in identifying them as the same person. So that's the theory, but does it really stand up to scrutiny? Well, let's take a look a bit more closely. So one of the main issues is the chronology. So like I said, Norma Goodrich relies on the chronology that Vortigern became king in the 440s. That's based on the idea that the Anglo-Saxon invasion only started in about 447, which is based on a reading in Gildas to the effect that the Britons sent a letter to Aetius, supposedly after he was consul for the 3rd time, but obviously before his death. So that would place this letter after 447, and according to Gildas, the Anglo-Saxons only started invading after that. So that's the basic basis for this chronology, but the problem is that there are loads of issues with it. There are issues with this interpretation of Gildas's account, and there's earlier evidence which contradicts it. So, for example, the Gallic Chronicle of 452, which predates Gildas significantly, says that the Anglo-Saxons had already conquered Britain to a substantial degree by 441. So that's before Aetius even became consul for the 3rd time. So the sequence of events is that Vortigern became king, and then because of issues with the Picts and the Scots, at some point he sent a request to the Anglo-Saxons to come and serve as mercenaries for them. They did that for a while, then they rebelled, they started conquering territory, and then finally in 441 we find the Gallic Chronicle of 452 saying that Britain had fallen into the hands of the Saxons. So although the Gallic Chronicle doesn't refer to these previous events, the sequence that Gildas presents us with must mean that Vortigern became king much earlier than the 440s. There's an alternative date in the Historia Brittonum which explicitly says that he became king in 425, and then it then goes on to say that the Anglo-Saxons arrived in 429. So that matches perfectly with the evidence from the Gallic Chronicle of 452, and it also matches archaeological evidence that the Anglo-Saxons arrived in about 430. That's the date currently given by archaeology, 430. So the point is, the evidence is very strong that Vortigern became king much earlier than the traditional date, much earlier than the date used by Norma Goodrich in her theory about Merlin and Dubricius. So this would mean that Merlin was actually born decades before Dubricius. So chronologically, they actually don't match. And that ties in with an alternative explanation for why Geoffrey stops talking about Merlin at about the time he starts talking about Dubricius. The simple explanation, which isn't the one given by Norma Goodrich, but it's a very simple logical explanation and it ties in with this chronological evidence, is that Merlin's career ended pretty much when Dubricius's career started. That's what the chronology would suggest, and that explains perfectly the reason why Geoffrey stops talking about Merlin at about the time he starts talking about Dubricius. It's simply because their careers didn't really overlap. So it makes complete sense that we don't see them both described as separate individuals in the same accounts, because they didn't really interact with each other, because they weren't close contemporaries. But at the same time, it's also true that there are some similarities between them, like, for example, the fact that they both had illegitimate births, and also they both performed miracles. Well, regarding these 2 points, they're not very specific. That's the key problem. Regarding miracles, this is an exceptionally weak piece of evidence. Practically all the lives of the saints, of which there are many, refer to the saints in question as performing miracles. If you take the life of St. Cadog, or the life of St. Illtyd, or the life of St. David, or the life of St. anyone, you're bound to find miracles. That's what these hagiographies do. They present a biography of this religious figure designed to promote them and show how marvelous they were and how they were blessed by God and all this. So they present them as doing miracles. This happens all the time in these hagiographies. So it's no surprise whatsoever to find Dubricius and Merlin both performing miracles. That's just the nature of being a religious figure in what's called the Age of the Saints. These religious figures were associated with miracles. So this isn't a specific detail at all. In fact, it would be surprising if one of the two of them was not associated with miracles. Now, regarding the illegitimate birth, that's a bit more specific, admittedly. This can't be assigned to just anyone. However, it's also not very specific either. So the problem is that there are lots of people who are said to be illegitimate in the Arthurian era, including saints. It's not very common, but it's also not so uncommon that it raises eyebrows at seeing two people described this way. There's no reason to assume that they're the same person. There's nothing exceptionally distinctive about it. So the main issue, summing up, is that this theory relies primarily on generic evidence, generic connections between these two figures. You could find similar connections between Merlin and all number of other saints. There's nothing really special about Dubricius which requires him to have been Merlin, and the evidence we do have in the way of chronology explicitly rules out this identification. So I would say no, Merlin is not Dubricius. I do think that there is a historical figure who he can very, very clearly be identified with, and I'll do a video in the future about that, the actual historical identity of Merlin in the 5th century. For now though, if you'd like to know, have archaeologists discovered the Palace of Odysseus on Ithaca, then come back next time for my next video.